Okay, so we are going to go through the reproductive system for the male first and then the female. And this is for lab, and we're going to be going through our lab outline. So you might want to have that with you as we talk about these structures. So to start with, we're going to go through the male reproductive system and talk about some relevant organs there. So to start with, the primary male sex organ is the testes. And so they're located here. And if we look at them in our next view, they're going to be located here and here. So there's a left and a right testes. And a couple things are happening here. This is where sperm is being produced, as well as steroid-based sex hormones. Testosterone mainly is being produced here. So the testes have two layers. So if we were to look at it and dissect away layers, we see that there's two layers of the testes. And the most external layer, or the more superficial layer, is going to be the Tunica Vaginalis. And we can see that here and here. And we have two layers of this. So there is a parietal Tunica Vaginalis and a visceral Tunica Vaginalis. And then right against the testes itself is a layer that is a little whiter in color, and that is the Tunica Albuginea. So if we were to peel back the vaginalis layer and we look deep to it, you can kind of see underneath here, it's a layer that's a little bit lighter, and that's going to be the Tunica Albuginea. And that plays a role in a little bit. We'll talk about how it divides the testes up into lobes and some other things going on there. So what we see with the scrotum is that it's basically consisting of skin and superficial fat. And what it does is it houses the testes outside the body, and that keeps them a little bit cooler. In fact, they're about 3 degrees Celsius cooler than your typical body temperature, and that's the perfect temperature for sperm production. So that's why we have it set up like that. There is also a muscle that's going to travel down from the abdomen, and it's going to travel into the scrotum, and that's called the cremaster muscle. And the cremaster muscle is a continuation of the internal oblique muscle. And if you remember, that's one of the muscles that's part of our abdominal musculature. And so it sends down this little slip called cremaster muscle. And so what that does is when it contracts, it actually serves to elevate the testes so that I could actually pull them upwards a little more superior and bring them closer to the body if it's too cold outside. So it maintains that perfect temperature for them. The second muscle that's part of the scrotum is going to be the dartos muscle, and that's here. And if you look, if we dissect through the scrotum and we go deep to the skin, you can see this layer of dartos muscle here. And this is a layer of smooth muscle. It's embedded in the fascia of the scrotum, and it also serves to maintain the perfect temperature of the testes. So if, again, the testes are exposed to colder air, it's actually going to wrinkle up the skin of the testes, wrinkle up the skin of the scrotum to keep the testes warm if they're exposed to cooler air. Okay. Next structure is going to be the fact, we talked about this before, that layer of the testes, the Tunica Albuginea. What it does is it actually dives deep into the testes, and what's going to happen is it's going to divide the testes into lobes, and it divides them into like 250 lobules, these different little areas. So all of these lines here would be areas where that Tunica Albuginea kind of dives in deep and invaginates into the testes and divides them into these lobules. Well, these lobules are going to contain seminiferous tubules. And so this is this kind of tangled mess of this tubular network. And these contain a couple different things. So we've got cells within the seminiferous tubules that are going to be spermatogenic cells that form sperm. And also located around those seminiferous tubules, we have what are called Leydig cells, and they are responsible for producing testosterone. So the spermatogenic cells in this area are going to produce the sperm, and the sperm basically are going to travel through these seminiferous tubules. They travel through this tubular system, and they end up traveling into the tubules of this structure here, which is the epididymis. Okay. The body of our epididymis. And this is basically like a little, it's kind of a long structure on the posterior aspect of the testes. You can see it in this picture here. Here's our epididymis, and we have this kind of long coiled structure on the back, on the posterior aspect of it. And so what happens is that the immature sperm are released from the spermatogenic cells in the seminiferous tubules, and they basically travel from those seminiferous tubules into the epididymis. And we've got a long coiled kind of tubular system through there. It basically takes about 20 days for the sperm to be produced and then to travel into the epididymis. And at that point, they learn how to swim, they gain the ability to be mobile, and they basically are being stored in the epididymis until they are ejaculated from the body. So epididymis is basically just a site of storage for sperm. And actually what happens is if they aren't ejaculated within that like 20-day time period, they are basically just reabsorbed by the body because the testes are constantly making more, so they're constantly being replaced. Okay, so the structure that's going to leave the epididymis is this tube called the Vas Deferens. Okay, it's also called the Ductus deferens, so you'll see both names to that. But this is basically a tube that's going to travel from the epididymis, and it basically loops around the top of the urinary bladder, and posterior to it, it's going to travel through the prostate and then out through the penis and then to the outside of the body. And so this is basically the way that sperm that's being stored in the epididymis is able to leave the body through ejaculation. This is the pathway that it's going to travel. So I also want to bring up that when men have a vasectomy, what ends up happening is they'll go in and they'll just cut that vas deferens. So vasectomy, ectomy means to cut. So they've cut that vas deferens. So everything else is intact. The testes are intact. The vas deferens is intact. The testes are still making sperm. It's just what happens is that during ejaculation, those sperm can't, they don't have access to the outside of the body. So they're still being made and they're still being stored in that epididymis, but they're constantly being made and they're constantly being actually reabsorbed by the body because they don't end up leaving. But that's what happens there. That vas deferens is cut during a vasectomy. Another structure that I wanted to talk about is a structure called the spermatic cord, and that's highlighted here. And this is a structure. It's kind of a collection of structures that passes through the inguinal ligament. So this is something that we've talked about before. We've talked about this kind of inguinal area here that's running from ASIS to pubis, and we do have a ligament that travels across there too, and this is also that area when you flex your hip, you kind of form that crease on the anterior part of your hip. But this spermatic cord actually pierces through the inguinal ligament, and it actually contains a few different structures that are relevant here. So it's going to contain nerves that travel down into the testes. We've got arteries, we've got veins. The ductus deferens or the vas deferens is going to travel through there as well. But you are able to palpate the structure. You can usually kind of roll across it. And it also may be something that comes into play if you have a patient or an athlete who has an inguinal hernia. You may be able to palpate that on them as well. But that's the spermatic cord, and it does include several structures. Okay, so we have 3 glands that are present in the male reproductive system that contribute to semen. And what happens is that they all contribute in a different way. So they're all there to increase sperm mobility. They're there to provide sugar for energy for the sperm, or to improve the fertilizing ability of the sperm. Okay? So the first gland that contributes to sperm or to semen is the seminal vesicles. And so these are located here. You're going to have one on each side of the bladder. Okay, and so they're located posterior to the bladder, and these contain an alkaline fluid and comprise about 75% of the total volume of semen. And so what you find is that the female reproductive system tends to be a little more acidic, and so semen tends to be a little more alkaline to cut some of the acidity of the female reproductive tract. Seminal vesicles also release seminal fluid that contains fructose, and semen use that as an energy source. The second gland that we're going to talk about is the prostate gland, and that's going to be this structure right here. Okay, so that's the prostate gland. And so the prostate is this little like almond-shaped gland. It's located just inferior to the bladder, and it secretes what's called the prostate-specific antigen. And that is an antigen that's tested for in order to confirm diagnosis, or if it's elevated, it will indicate the possibility of prostate cancer in men. And the prostate gland is full of smooth muscle, and what happens is it contracts during ejaculation, and so it continues to squeeze its secretions into the urethra and pass the semen on its way. And then the third gland is the bulbourethral gland, and this is also known as Cowper's gland, and this is going to be located, little glands right down here, right in kind of the base of the prostate, and right along the base of some of the pelvic floor musculature, and it's going to send out its contribution to semen as well. One of the things that also secretes is a mucus that helps lubricate the penis and basically makes things kind of ready for intercourse for the sperm to be able to make their way in. So a couple other things here. We talked about the epididymis, so that's where our sperm is basically stored, and when it's ejected from the epididymis, It's going to travel through the Vas Deferens. It travels up over top of the urinary bladder, and then it's going to come down here, and it's actually going to merge with the seminal vesicle. And that creates this duct here that's going to travel through the prostate gland, and we call that the ejaculatory duct. So the sperm doesn't go up into the seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicle contributes to the semen and combines with the vas deferens to create the ejaculatory duct. Sperm is then going to travel through the prostatic urethra, which is going to be this area of the urethra here. So again, this is the bladder, and so we've got the urethra that's also emptying, from the bladder and is traveling down. So at this point, from the prostatic urethra on, we've got both urine and sperm that's being conveyed through that urethra. Then we're going to travel into the membranous urethra, which is this area here. And again, that's going to travel through, basically we call it the urogenital diaphragm. It's kind of like a base of muscle that helps to support all these structures. Then we're going to have a contribution from the bulbourethral gland. It's going to join in and send its contribution to the semen. We're going to travel out through the spongy urethra, going all the way through the penis, and then out to the external world. Okay, so this is showing you too, sometimes we have in men enlarged prostate, and you'll see that sometimes as a diagnosis with some of your older male patients. It's a pretty common diagnosis. But just to show you that this is what happens here. Here's the enlarged prostate, and you know that we have the urethra that's traveling through it. Well, if the prostate is enlarged, then it kind of encroaches on the space of that urethra, and it's difficult to empty the bladder. So that's one of the difficulties that men can have with an enlarged prostate. I do want to point out we have some name changes throughout the male urethra. So if we're coming from the bladder and we're heading out, we've got the first section of the urethra is the prostatic urethra, and that's because it's traveling through the prostate gland. The second part of the urethra is the membranous urethra, and that's traveling through that urogenital diaphragm. Here on either side, you can see these are the bulbourethral glands indicated there. And then as we travel through kind of the main part of the penis, you'll see that as the either penile urethra or spongy urethra. So you'll see that in both ways. I also wanted to point out, look how long this urethra is, right? So pay attention to that. I'm also going to bring that up again when we talk about the female anatomy. This is one of the primary reasons why females are more likely to get bladder infections, because males have this really long urethra and it's much harder for bacteria to make this trip in. Females have these little short urethras, and it's a lot easier for bacteria to gain access to their bladders as a result of that. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to talk about here is some smooth muscle that's located in the penis itself. So if we took it and we cut it in cross-section, transverse plane view, we would see there's two types of smooth muscle that are located here. So one of them is going to be the corpus cavernosum, and that's going to be this layer of spongy muscle here. It basically comes in like two lobes when you look at it in cross-section. The second type of smooth muscle that's located in the penis is the corpus spongiosum, and this is the smooth muscle that actually surrounds the spongy urethra as it's traveling through the penis and then out to the outside of the body. Okay, I included this just so you could follow along the pathway of the sperm. like we talked about in the video. Okay, so now on to female reproductive anatomy. So where in the male anatomy, the gonads or the primary sex organs are the testes, in the female, they're kind of analogous primary sex organ is the ovary. And so that's what we see here and here. And so this serves as the site of production and storage of our oocytes. And so that's going to be the eggs or gametes that are produced. And then what you have is just basically one oocyte, hopefully, is released every month during ovulation. And so what happens is that oocyte is released and it actually travels out into just the interior of the pelvic cavity. So there is a period of time where it's basically just not contained within the reproductive system. It's just kind of out there in the pelvic cavity. And then the next place that it's going to move to is the fallopian tube. And so that's going to be the structure here. This whole structure here is the uterine tube, otherwise known as the fallopian tube. And this is where the ovulated oocyte that's been released from the ovary is going to travel and start making its trip down the fallopian tube and into the uterus. It's kind of a transportation area. So we have a couple different structures that are specific to the fallopian tube. So one of them is at the end. If you notice here at the end of the fallopian tube, we have these little finger-like projections, and these are called fimbriae. And so these are these extensions of the fallopian tube, and when the oocyte is released, they actually move and they create waves in the interstitial fluid within the pelvic cavity. And so they're basically going to call that oocyte, they're going to create waves in the fluid, and they're going to make that oocyte flow into the fallopian tube. So these are kind of finger-like projections that help to pull that egg into the fallopian tube. Now, sometimes it doesn't happen, and maybe sometimes that oocyte becomes fertilized out in the pelvic cavity and not within the fallopian tube, and that kind of creates an issue. That's what's called an ectopic pregnancy. So not a good thing, but sometimes it does happen. So those are the fimbriae. As the oocyte travels down the fallopian tube, the next area that it's going to travel through is called the infundibulum. That's the next area of the fallopian tube. And then we have the ampulla of the fallopian tube. So that's kind of like this bend part here. And then we've got the isthmus of the fallopian tube. And that's going to be kind of this thinner part here, right as we get into the uterus. Okay. The next thing we have ligaments that are part of the female reproductive. And that, okay, so this is showing you the different parts of the fallopian tube. In terms of ligaments, we have a couple different ligaments here. We have an ovarian ligament, which basically attaches ovary to uterus, okay, and it helps to stabilize these structures. And then we also have the broad ligament, which is going to be here, and over on the other side, it's going to be here. And so basically it runs from the uterus to the walls of the pelvic cavity, and it helps to stabilize the reproductive structures. So our next organ is going to be the uterus. So the egg, typically the oocyte is fertilized somewhere up here in the fallopian tube, and it's going to travel on down to the uterus. So that's our next organ. The uterus has 3 layers, and let's see. Uterus is going to have 3 layers. The outer layer of the uterus, if we look at it in cross section, is called the perimetrium. And this is a very thin, most external layer. The middle layer of the uterus is going to be the myometrium, and this is the layer of smooth muscle, just like in a lot of structures that we find in anatomy. And then our innermost layer is the endometrium, and this is the highly vascular layer. It's highly supplied by arterial blood from the uterine arteries. And so these are the arteries, the spiral arteries that branch off of that are the arteries that regenerate and degenerate and create a shedding of that endometrial layer when females menstruate. So the next structure here is kind of this dome-shaped structure on the top, and that's called the fundus of the uterus. The main part of the uterus through here is called the body of the uterus. And then we travel down and we come to this kind of narrowed pathway at the bottom, and that's the cervix. So that's going to be this narrowed area between the uterus and the vagina, which is just inferior to it. Okay, so here's another look here too. Here's your narrowed area of your cervix. That's basically going to be your connection between the uterus and the vagina here. Okay, here's our 3 layers of the uterus, and basically showing you the spiral arteries that are going to branch off of the uterine arteries that supply the uterus with arterial blood. The vagina, if you look at the vagina, it's basically like a thin tube, and it also has 3 layers. So it has an outer adventitia layer, it's got a middle muscularis layer, and an internal mucosal layer. So it's got 3 layers as well. I did want to point out a lot of you working with patients, especially with older women, might find in their medical history that they've had hysterectomies. And so I just wanted to point out some different kind of varieties of hysterectomies. If a woman comes in and she's had a partial hysterectomy, it basically means that they have removed the main part of the uterus. I mean, these procedures were a lot more common years ago, and so it's definitely going to be more common in an older population. Sometimes this is the case if you have someone with a history of maybe cervical cancer or uterine cancer. That might be an indication for performing a hysterectomy, but my impression is that these aren't routine surgeries anymore like they used to be. A total hysterectomy would be removal of the uterus, including the cervix. So they would remove all of that. And then you can also have a total hysterectomy where they've just basically removed everything. So they've taken away uterus and cervix and the ovaries, as well as the fallopian tubes. Although there are occasions where we've seen cadavers come in with one ovary that they leave intact because the ovaries secrete estrogen, and that maintains a level of estrogen for that patient.